Okay, we have an opportunity now to engage you, the audience here in London, with some questions. Could I ask, I'm going to take a few at a time, if that's all right, Tony. Please keep your questions short, and it should be a question. If it turns into a comment, I'm going to cut you off, because we would like to have a couple of rounds if possible. So I'm going to offer the first to Nick Gowing there, who's in the front, and then the front here with David.
Nick Gowing, good morning, Mr. Blair. I'm not here for the BBC. I'm actually on the Council of ODI, and I'm going to raise something which I raised at the Council of the ODI last week. You talk about governance, but I'd put to you that actually time is not on the side of governance, particularly in Africa at the moment, because of the power of social media and because of the expectations. And we've seen it even in Singapore, where the government had a really rude shock in the election back in May, when they were suddenly finding that the majority was small compared to what it was. And I'd like to ask you, when you talk about democracy and delivery are important, what about the issue of empowerment now, which is shortening the timelines for delivery and putting real pressure on those in power?
Well, it's an interesting question. And by the way, I think this is for a whole other session with a whole other topic, which is the role of social media and its interaction with leadership today. Because I think you also see this, obviously, in the Arab revolution that's going on. I think that people, well, first of all, I think the empowerment is a good thing, but what it requires is leaders also then to be able to interact with people and explain. You know, explain that it's not easy. Explain what you're trying to do. Explain how you're trying to do it. And I guess what I would say is that, you know, the timeline is not just a function of the social media. It's also a function of the interaction between the leaders and the people. Because, and this is why prioritization is so important. You see, sometimes what I say to some of the African leaders is, look, tell them you're going to do 3 things. Because, by the way, that's what I learned as well. Now, it's terribly difficult to do that. I remember, you know, when I came to power, it was education, 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 and I was very proud of this. And the first question I got asked by one of my party members the day after I gave this speech said, do you not care about the health service then? And I said, no, I mean, education, 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 and of course the health service. And then someone else said, well, what about law and order? I mean, you know, and then before you know where you are. But the point is that to get those key priorities, so for example, you know, you may say, actually, I'm going to get the lights on. I'm going to build the basic infrastructure for electricity and power. Now, I know there are 1,000 other things I've got to do, but I'm going to do that. I think you can hold people with you, provided you're showing that something can get done. And I think when you're interacting with people today with the social media, you know, it's important also to realize that the social media is a great way of raising a demand. It's not always a great way of giving an answer. And one of the things, you know, the leaders of the world, this is far more general than Africa or governments have got to do today, is they've got to understand that part of their job with today's interactive media is to challenge, you know, as well as simply respond. You know, and I'm always saying this to leaders from whatever part of the world, look, you can't just think that you've got a whole lot of people out there on the street. The simple thing is to go and stand there with them with a placard. Because, by the way, the general public out there is not expecting you to do that. They're expecting you to govern the damn country. Right? So you've got to be able to go out there and say, look, I understand what you're saying. But if you're going to make the demand, give me an answer. Because I can give you 3 choices as to what this answer is. And one requires more taxes and another requires something. You know what I mean? So now I agree with you. In Africa, it's tougher. And I agree with you, the timelines are shortened. But you've got no option today but to be prepared to engage and engage in a different way than before, which, by the way, I think is probably what they're doing in Singapore right now.
Thank you. Unsurprisingly, the room's beginning to light up with questions. So, Malcolm, if we could come down here to David in the front. And I'll see if we can maybe do 2 in one go, if you can hold it in mind.
Sure.
My name's David Booth. I coordinate a IFID-funded research program which is hosted by ODI called the Africa Power and Politics Program. In our program, and we think this central message about the importance of effective capacity to get things done as the centerpiece of the African governance problem is a terribly important message, and one that needs to be taken on board by DFID and by everybody at Busan. And because of this, we've had some close discussions with the Africa Governance Initiative, and we're very impressed by what they're doing in country. But I want to press you on a limitation, what we see as a limitation of this perspective at the moment. In one way, it's reflected in the fact that you have 3 countries. You've possibly got 4 countries in which you can work where you have a leadership which is basically committed. They happen to be all countries, the 3 at any rate, are post-conflict. They have a kind of blank sheet of paper situation. They're somewhat special. And my question is, are you prepared to go a bit beyond this to the point where you're also concerning yourselves with dysfunctional political systems which create conditions in which it's extremely difficult for that kind of leadership to emerge at all, because the 5-year cycle in the circumstances which prevail promotes an extremely sort of short-termist kind of orientation. I mean, these big infrastructure problems, which I think you rightly say are fundamental to turning the economic growth into transformative development, is a relatively medium-term, if not long-term thing. And what you have to do in the short term, within the 5-year cycle, to get that to happen, is risky and costly for a politician. You stand to lose. Mm-hmm. This generates a way of acting politically, even with people of goodwill, with lots of skill, which is a more fundamental problem, perhaps, than anybody is appreciating at the moment. So the question is, can we turn this concern with building effective capacity to get things done into a concern with getting the right kinds of political systems?
Okay, great.
The kind of example I have in mind is Kenya, where
yep.
terrifically short-term orientation is created because of the nature of the system. It's not because of the nature of the leaders.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's a big question. I'm going to ask you, hold on for that. Malcolm, Bruce here at the front, please, next.
Thank you. And I agree, first of all, that the creation of DFID was a fantastic achievement of your government, and that the untying of aid and the focus on poverty was really what made the difference. But I was going to ask you about ownership. You say country ownership. How do you define that? And if I give you the examples of Ethiopia, Rwanda, and the DRC. Ethiopia and Rwanda are probably delivering the aid program, if you like, and their own programs more effectively than perhaps any other countries in Africa, or many other countries in Africa. Mm-hmm. But the issue of human rights and opposition and democratic accountability are simply not there. On the other hand, in the DRC, you have neither of those things. You neither have political will, and you don't have any human rights either. So first of all, would you run away from the DRC because it's too difficult? The UK government's engaged. And secondly, how do you deal with Ethiopia and Rwanda that are clearly delivering poverty reduction and real results, but limiting the political space?
Great, thank you.
Well, these are 2 very good questions. I mean, I think, David, that you can change dysfunctional political systems, but it requires leaders of real imagination to do it. But if you look at Latin America, for example, and you go back 25, 30 years, then you look at what's happened in the last 10 or 15, I think you can see examples of where there have been leaders who've come through that have been prepared to risk it. Because, by the way, one of the curious things that I learned in politics is that, in the end, in a way, you have to kind of trust the people, that if you're, if you think you've got the right long-term vision, you've got to try and, people say, well, the right long-term vision costs you the short-term election. I mean, not necessarily is the answer if you're able to give them a real sense of how you can move forward. And one of the things that I think can be helpful in that, even where you've got a dysfunctional political system, is if someone's got the leadership skill, to bridge that. I mean, we're looking at 2 pictures here. I mean, that's what Mandela and de Klerk and Adams and McGuinness, where, there was a certain degree of leadership that enabled this to happen on all sides. So I think it can happen, and I think a country like Kenya, for example, it could be a fascinating example of how it could happen, by the way. I hope it does. And certainly as we expand, we will be going into countries where they're not simply post-conflict, where I agree. To an extent, they've got huge problems, but to an extent also they sort of say, well, we come and help us because we've been so down. I think in relation to Malcolm's point about, on the political development, you see, for me the key thing is whether Prime Minister Milish and President Kagame can evolve their systems. And I think they can, and I think they will. That's my judgment about both of them. I may be wrong about that, by the way, but that's my belief. But I do think in the changes they brought about in their country, I mean, you can't argue with the development that there's been. And, Rwanda is obviously a country we work in. Every time I go there, I'm seeing the place is moving. I think if you think where Ethiopia was and where it is, there's been remarkable change made. Now, it's a really difficult question, this, as to the balance between the stability that you need to make the change and the basic principles of democracy, opposition, free media, and so on. I mean, I suppose where I am on this is that I am prepared, if the results are strong, to say, okay, I can see that you need a process of transition rather than just suddenly, right? But there does need to be a transition and a development in the end. With the Congo, I mean, I think with the Congo it's partly just as simple as it's a big place. I mean, I know Ethiopia is a big place too, but it's, I think, but the Congo is a classic example, I would say, of a country. I mean, we would certainly be interested in doing stuff there, where I think you would absolutely have to focus on a few key things. I think one of the other things I'm saying about this development argument that I see now is to focus on slightly different things as well, or in some cases very different things. So, for example, I think some of these countries need the building of proper military and civil police capacities, right? Because otherwise they can't even impose law and order in a fair or basic way. And I think when you can't provide that law, that basic security for people, I think it becomes very hard to develop a country. So I think one of the problems with the Congo, for example, is just, if the writ of the government doesn't run, how do you do anything? And then I think, as I say, I may be wrong in this, but I just have this increasing feeling that because of the way the technology is developed, and because I think one of the fascinating things about Africa is looking at mobile telephony and how it's been used by people, I think if you can provide electricity, you're a long way towards liberating a country's potential. And I think that's different, definitively different from, say, 15 years ago. And the really interesting thing, too, is, you just know how much entrepreneurial spirit there is there with no outlet at all, where if they were able to, we could make such a big difference. But, we started this initiative, 3 and a bit years ago, and it's taken us time to build this proof of concept. There's one other thing I'd like to throw out there, which we do. We actually bring in teams from all different parts of both the world and also, for example, when we're helping people on the private sector, we'll often bring in people from the private sector. And I think there's also a different skill set that you can develop as well for development. I think one of the things I'm very interested in trying to do is to put together groups of lawyers and so on who would be prepared to come and give a year of their time to go and work and negotiate resource contracts and things for some of these. One of the things I noticed with some of these governments is that, they're going to negotiate with these big multinationals who've got, huge firepower behind them in terms of expertise. And, they got some guys just wandering in there who's trying to do his best for his country. But, you require that level of expertise. And I would love to see, I'm sure there are lots of imaginative ways too that we can bring people into this development circle, really. Because what I notice about all the people we get for AGI is they're delighted to come and do it. If it's a year or 2 years. Actually, if you're, if you think about it, if you're, say, let's say you're part of the UK government or American government or whatever, you can say you've gone and spent a year or 2 years in the country. It's good career development for you. You're learning a lot. You're actually doing it on the ground. You've probably got more opportunity to get things done than you would in the normal course of government. So I think there's a whole area that I'd really like to see expanded and to build links between different organisations around.
Great, thank you very much. Next is Bailey there, and then I'll take a couple. Bear with me, I'll work through them as well as I can.
Hugh Bailey, I chair the Africa All-Party Group in Parliament. I understand, Tony, why you say without a strong centre nothing ever gets done, but I would say in a lot of African countries the strong centre of a strong presidency is as much of a curse as a blessing. And in order to develop capacity, I believe you need to develop a broader political class, both so that you've got a pool of politicians, parliamentarians possibly, from whom you can draw future presidents, and also as checks and balances. If you think after the last election in Kenya, I think the Parliament played an important part in saying we've got to work across the ethnic groups and solve this crisis. You look at Uganda perhaps more recently, where the checks and balances you'd expect on a presidency aren't there. So to what extent will you work out from the Prime Minister's or President's office and improve governance in parliaments?
Let me just take one more. Larry Elliott, who's on the back row there. And then
Larry Elliott, both from The Guardian and an ODI council member. I just wondered whether we could explore the position in the donor countries here for a minute, because the paradox seems to be that aid is becoming more effective just as there's less support for it in the donor countries. If you go back to 2005, where no one had ever heard of subprime mortgages, the Western world was actually doing pretty well. The G8 could focus on Africa pretty intensively. I mean, the Gleneagles Summit talked mainly about climate change in Africa. And if you roll the camera forward, we've now got lots of countries which are quite hard up themselves, cutting their own public spending at home, and there seems to be a diminution in public support. There's nothing like make poverty history. And I just wondered whether you think there's a risk now that the mood will turn against aid in the donor countries, and if you do think there's a risk of that, what can be done about it?
First of all, Hugh, let me amend the strong leader, somewhat at least. It depends what they're trying to do, obviously. And, you could say that Mugabe was a strong leader in one sense. All I'm saying is this. Yes, of course, part of the political evolution has to be the development of strong, parliamentarians, ministries, and so on. So, and by the way, for example, in Rwanda, having worked at the centre, we're now working in the ministries and building the capacity there. That is absolutely right. All I'm saying is just a very simple thing, which is that in the end, what I discovered is that, and I think, by the way, I think these lessons of government are very, very broadly applicable, is that unless there was a clear strategy and vision at the centre and you were driving it, nothing much could get done. And that is also, by the way, very familiar to anybody with the British system, is this cross-departmental working and the difficulties of departments all working in their silos and so on. It's exactly the same in Africa. If you're trying to get agriculture boosted, how do you do that without sorting out parts of infrastructure? How do you do that without your private sector inward investment matching up to what you're trying to do? So I think you do require, so this concept of sort of delivery, stock take, monitoring performances from the centre, I think needs to be done. But I agree, of course, in the end, a country's, you want to be building the institutions of the country of strength and depth. I think in respect of aid, look, it's two things have happened at once, which, as you rightly say, Larry, leads to the unfortunate paradox that right at the moment when actually you could say aid is working most effectively and people are really thinking about about, you know, much more creatively and imaginatively about aid, right at that moment, two things have happened. Countries are very strapped for cash because they're cutting budgets, and it's a really, you know, I actually think it's a great tribute to our country that, in a way, okay, there are some people jibbing at the commitment to aid of the government, but not as many as you might expect, actually, in these circumstances. And that's one reason why I think it's great that you've got this consensus about it across the political spectrum. But you've got countries are strapped for cash, and then at the same time you've had the dead aid thesis, which, you know, is wrong, but a bit of it you understand why it's being said, which is what makes it actually quite difficult for people operating within the aid and development sphere. And that's why I think the answer to it is to show, in a way, that this is not an area where we've stopped thinking. You know, this is an area where we are also prepared to evolve and develop in our thoughts. And that's why the Busan thing is important. I mean, I'm going to go to Busan myself. I think it's really important that we have quite a focus around that, where we're explaining to people, we're not just sitting still with this aid business. The reason we put aid effectiveness as the title and the agenda is because we recognize we've got faults, but before you look at the faults, just look at some of the things that have been achieved. And, you know, I think, you know, I think too there is just some very basic facts we need to get across to people about what aid has achieved. You know, and then if you're able to add a whole dimension to that, which is about how we are evolving the policy agenda around aid, then I think we'll be in far better shape. I think the worst thing you know, I sometimes think this debate about aid is a little like the debate about welfare in, you know, the 80s and 90s. It's you need to take on board the criticism in order to be able to switch onto the front foot again.
Very good. We've got time for just a couple more, I'm afraid. On my list, I've got Mark Robinson just here, and then Barbara Frost just here to say.
Thank you very much. I'm Mark Robinson from DFID. I think evidence and experience certainly bears out your propositions that strong political commitment and direction, as well as capability across government, are essential to drive reform. But we do have lessons from history in Africa of reformist governments, large governments, coming out of political transition, civil war, which have driven reforms for exactly those reasons, but have found it really hard to sustain them beyond, say, a 10 or 15-year period. Are there useful lessons from that, especially where a number of donors, including ourselves, have invested very considerable resources in supporting those reform efforts? What is different now, apart from the very evident optimism and political commitment you've identified, that gives us hope that the reforms can be sustained and deepened this time round in the countries where both the initiative is located and further afield?
Thank you very much. Barbara Frost from WaterAid. I'd like to end with a very practical question, please, asking for advice. We know that there's been terrific progress made over the last years in terms of the poverty goals, in terms of the Millennium Development Goals, but the area that's really holding them back is lack of investment in safe sanitation. And what that needs is increased political will and increased capacity to deliver that most basic of service to really unleash the potential of good education and health, livelihoods, etc. Your thoughts on that one, please?
Mark, I think what's different this time round is the potential for private sector development, and in and around the resource space particularly, really. Look, I mean, the single most obvious thing in the world today is that China and India are going to grow. They're going massively to demand resources. Africa's got them. I mean, I know it's very crude to put it like that, but that's basically what is going on. And the reason why China is now investing more in the World Bank in Africa is perfectly simple. They need the resources. Now, there are a whole lot of issues with that, by the way, which we haven't discussed today, and is, again, another whole topic. But in my view, this is why we put such an emphasis on the private sector investment, inward investment into these countries. There is the possibility of also creating a genuine economic base from which you can then transition to a situation where governments are raising revenue. And that's what they need to do, by the way. I mean, that, you know, and there are examples in the last 10 years of countries, I mean, you can think of Ghana and Botswana, you can think of actually of Rwanda, where they've reduced their dependence on aid significantly, right? And I think that is the only way to make the reforms far-reaching and secure, because otherwise, you see, the thing about democracy is, I mean, we're all sort of, you know, loosely described as sort of political people, I mean, with a small p, not a big p necessarily. But, you know, what I notice about democracy, whether it's out in the Middle East or in Africa or elsewhere, is that ultimately people do put a very simple test on it, which is, you know, is it delivering for me? If it's not, then they kind of say, well, it's, you know, maybe it's better to have democracy than not, but I don't, what's this thing doing for me, right? So I think right out in the Middle East right now, a frustration with governments and their lack of economic achievement is as much a driver of change as a desire for democracy per se, although, you know, obviously that's there. So my point about democracy is that it only, and these reforms and reform-minded governments, they only take root when they have an economic dividend to them. And I think what is different and potentially exciting today is that if you could, this is where the capacity part is so important, if you have a proper way of developing the resources of these countries, you know, if they're doing it properly, they're going to get on their feet. I mean, I know, again, that sounds a really crude thing to say, but for many of these countries, if they're able to develop, I mean, if a country like Sierra Leone were able to develop its natural resources in a transparent and proper way, you know, if they got the right type of investment and not the wrong type of investment in, and they got people with a long-term commitment, and they then made the changes in infrastructure that are necessary, they'd be away. I mean, what is it? It's a you know, a lot of these African countries, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to say, but in the early 60s, their GDP was probably around about, you know, proportionately South Korea's or something. I don't know, you know, these comparisons people always make. So I think it is, that's what's different today. And what's different politically is, as I say, this, what I use the term younger loosely, which as I get older I do increasingly use it loosely, as anyone under the age that I might attain in a few years' time. But it's, you know, what I notice about them is they're not, this is why I say it's something a little bit similar to me that I noticed in India going back some time, is where the politicians stop talking to you about the past. Stop talking about all the things to do with, you know, but you've got to realize all these problems we had, you know, you left us with all these, you know, all this narrative, it's just not there. With a lot of the ones I'm doing, they're just saying, right, come on, give us some help with getting things done here. We need to, you know, what's the right way to do it? Look, here are our problems, and it's a practical, you know, very focused solution on it. Which brings me to the question on sanitation, which, I mean, I think this is where you, again, as I say, these basic infrastructure issues are really important today. I mean, and I would probably try and start with my, at least try and start with my main urban centres in that. And it's also where those people who are prepared to commit to infrastructure can make a big difference. I mean, this is where, you know, as I say, I've occasionally mentioned the issue of China today, but I mean, I think there's a real case for a strong dialogue, actually, between ourselves and the Chinese about where policy goes. But just to say self-critically of ourselves about what I notice with China, is that whatever are the issues, you've got to say when it comes to some of the basic infrastructure, they are prepared to commit and get in there and get working. Now, I'm totally alive to all the other issues that you've got to raise around that, but one of the reasons why I do think there are areas where we could cooperate with them is I think some of this basic infrastructure, you know, it just does make such a difference. And, you know, I think one of the things we, who are generally, for our lifestyle issues, generally healthy, don't understand, and I only have started to understand it curiously once I've gone into Africa far more having left office, is the not just the degrading but the depleting effect of illness, a lot of which comes obviously from poor sanitation, because it just means people don't feel well, and when they don't feel well, you know, it's quite hard to make a country move. And so you know, that's why, I mean, I haven't worked all this out yet in my own mind, but I think one big topic for us in Busan is, should we be looking at infrastructure differently now than 10 years ago, and should we be trying to do it differently? Are there new ways that we could do the infrastructure part of this? Because I do, you know, get the strong impression that for many of these, you know, if I'm in Freetown and Monrovia, I'm in Kigali, the basic infrastructure starts to fit into place. Everything else comes a lot easier, and maybe there's new ways that we can also help develop that infrastructure that are more imaginative than the past. So, you know, that's my point really about Busan. I think it's a great moment in which to showcase the fact that as the world's moving, we're moving.
Fantastic, and I think that's a great note for which to finish. Apologies to those who had your hands up, I'm afraid. We didn't have the time to take everyone's questions, but I think very much the sort of feeling I'm left with as a result of Tony's reflections today is a reminder, in fact, that, you know, progress in development has, without question, rested on country efforts under effective, capable, visionary leadership. And I think that's a really important message as we head into Busan. But that's not a responsibility only of countries within Africa and elsewhere. It's also the responsibility of the international community to get behind that and the political vision that involves. And I think heading into Busan, your messaging around that would be incredibly valuable, as is this notion that, you know, leaders on the African continent in particular are now beginning to see the aid phenomena differently as they plan their futures and start to think about a world beyond aid. Thank you very much indeed for your comments today. Thank you, all of you who've been here in the room and those who've been able to watch us online. Thank you very much.